Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about SFTP as a secure way of transferring files. Previously, we wrote a blog post that included code from GitHub on how to create one from scratch in AWS. Since that post, however, AWS launched a new service called Transfer Family that's been around for a couple years already. As a follow-up to that blog, we're going to take a look at this newer service. With Transfer Family's SFTP server, you get a fully managed and resilient system, including management of the system's users. This does come at a premium price, however, so do be mindful of that. In this video, we'll create all the pieces needed to set up and use AWS's SFTP service. In a matter of minutes, we'll show you how to go from SFTP 0 to SFTP Hero. Let's begin. To get started, we assume you already have an AWS account where you have the appropriate permissions to access S3, AWS Transfer Family, and AWS IAM for user permissions and roles. To begin, open up the AWS Transfer Family within the AWS console. Once you're here, you'll see that there's a couple of options on the left-hand side. The primary one we're going to focus on is the server section. Before we do, though, I do want to highlight this diagram that explains a little bit of how this works. SFTP connectors are very different than SFTP server, but this diagram is worth noting that this is how things are kind of set up. On the front end, there's an SFTP server. This diagram here shows connector, but there is an SFTP server that we're about to create. And behind that is going to be an S3 bucket that houses all of the files uploaded and downloaded from what's going to be your SFTP server. Because the files are saved directly in S3, what's nice is, on the back side of things, you can use a lot of other services that are natively integrated with S3. You can have Lambdas trigger off of file uploads, you can have AWS Backup and Glacier, do different things to it. So it's really nice to leverage the other services and features of AWS that happen once your files go through your SFTP server into S3. But to begin, like I said, we're going to start off over here on servers. To get started, there's a button over on the top right for Create Server. So we're going to just click through this, and most of what we're going to do are default settings, not only here in AWS Transfer Family, but also in S3. Because a lot of this is just ready to go out of the box. There are different transfer protocols you can use, but we're going to focus on SFTP, primarily because that's what our previous blog was about, but it's one of the more secure ways of setting up file transfers. It's a transfer protocol that happens over SSH. So we'll leave that one checked and click Next. For identity providers, there are a couple of options, but we're going to go with the default one here, which is just letting this SFTP service handle the creation, management, and deletion of the users. So we'll leave this as service managed, and we'll click Next. For our endpoint type, we're going to go with publicly accessible. We want to have this open on the internet, only to users that we specify, which we'll get into later. So that's kind of the use case that we're going to do right now. It's going to be a publicly accessible SFTP server. Further, there's an option here for the host name. This is how people can get to your SFTP server. If you specify none, you'll end up getting a default host name that's based in some sort of AWS domain with Transfer Family. But we're going to go with an Amazon Route 53 DNS alias. And we're going to set this up. We already have some records set up in Route 53 for a domain called Let's Play. So we're going to make this sftp.letsplay.sketchdev.io. Lastly, on the bottom of this page, there's an option for just different kinds of enhanced security. We can go ahead and check this. You can leave it blank. It doesn't matter either way. And because I said we'll go with defaults for the most part, I'm just going to leave that unchecked for now. So we'll just click on Next and proceed to the next screen. The next options here specify how you want the data to be stored. I was showing that diagram earlier and talking about how S3 can be your storage backing mechanism. You can also use AWS EFS, but again, because our previous blog that we wrote about used S3 as the data store, we're going to use this still. So again, sticking with the defaults, leave it on S3 and click Next. This next screen goes over a handful of other additional details, most of which we're just going to leave blank. It's for logging purposes for users who connect to the SFTP server. It'll track that. It also it'll log things if you want to have events immediately triggered when files are uploaded to your server. And so this logging section and the managed workflows, they kind of go hand in hand for that aspect, where you can specify different workflows or lambdas that get initiated on like when the file is fully uploaded or when part of the file is uploaded. So there's some really great event integration in here for the SFTP service. But if you keep scrolling down, there's a couple more things we can take a look at. Again, we're going with the defaults. There's different cryptographic security policies. The one that should be checked for you by default is the latest one that is non-experimental. So we're just going to leave this one checked as it is. But this next section here, this one's pretty interesting. So the server host key, when you connect to an SFTP server, the very first time you do it, you'll be prompted with an SSH key fingerprint validation alert saying, this is the server's fingerprint. Is this the server you meant to connect to? Do you trust this server? We're going to leave this blank for now just because we're creating a brand new one from scratch. But what's really nice is you could specify your own private key here. And where that's useful is if you already have an existing SFTP server that you have a user base connecting to, with some DNS magic, you can shift things around to have your end users come now to this new SFTP service rather than your existing SFTP server. However, if you don't provide that key in this box here that you're using for your existing SFTP server, all your users are going to get some really nasty red alerts popping up saying, hey, wait a second, this is not the server that you have acknowledged before. We think there's some sort of hacking going on, or something's definitely wrong here. So lots of warnings will pop up, and it's really nice that this is provided as an option here. Again, since we are just doing this from scratch, just as a demo, I'm going to leave this all blank, and AWS is going to end up creating just its own unique private key for our SFTP instance here. Then there's a section for tags. I highly recommend anybody who does anything with AWS put tags in here. These can be any number of things. I typically like to put created by, so I can always see who created it and why. It helps clean things up later. You should put all sorts of other tags here, like what the environment's for, if there's any kind of billing tag associated with it for your organization, whatever. It's always great to put tags. Again, since this is a demo, I don't have a lot of tags that I want to share or do, so I'm just going to keep this created by with my name there just for good practice. Optimized directories, we'll leave this with its default setting. It's just going to make sure things go a little faster and smoother. Display banners, I'm going to leave this blank too, but this is where when people first connect, you can have it pop up this message to them just saying, welcome to my SFTP server, or whatever you want. And then a couple other things here, we're just going to leave, again, like I said, all these at their default settings, and we're just going to click next to continue. So lastly, we're on the review screen. This is just showing everything we set up. Not a whole lot to do here other than look at it. And because we did, for the most part, just the default settings, we're good to go. So I'm going to click on the Create Server button. Once I've clicked Create Server, it takes us to a screen where it shows us that the server, the SFTP server, is getting booted up. And you'll see that here as it indicates it's starting. We can proceed with the next steps before this is ready, but you can always keep clicking this refresh button to see if and when it's ready. The other thing that's apparent here that shows up right in our face, bright and red, is the fact that there's no users. We'll get to that in a little bit, but before we add our first user, we do need to set up both the backend storage mechanism that this is going to use, which is an S3 bucket, and we'll also set up some roles through AWS IAM that allow the users to connect to the S3 buckets. So we'll go on to that next, starting with S3. Clicking over to the S3 console, we're going to create a bucket here, and for the most part, we'll use all the defaults that are on this screen for configuring a bucket. First thing we need to do is just make sure that we give it a bucket name. So in our case, we'll call this sftp.sketchdev.io. We'll just whatever you need as a bucket name, but it has to be original and unique throughout any and all user accounts within AWS. For object ownership, we're going to leave this as the default with ACLs disabled. That goes a little bit hand in hand with the block public access option here as well. Again, keep in mind, we want all these files to be super secure and not available to the public, except through users who are authenticated through our SFTP server. So the SFTP server, that's the mechanism that users will access the files, and we're just using S3 as the data storage in the back end. So we want to make sure this is checked here to block all public access and just leave these as the default. We don't want anyone bypassing our SFTP server and just getting to the files directly through S3. So leave that alone and move on to the next options. Bucket versioning, you can do this either way. We're going to have it disabled, again, just for defaults. And as I've been showing you, it's always great to be tagging your resources. So I'm going to do one of my standards created by Ryan. You should add a whole bunch more. I normally do, but for this demo, we're just adding at least that tag for good practice. For bucket encryption, there are a couple options here. Normally, you'd probably want to use your own customer managed key that you can set up in KMS, which is AWS's key management service. But again, just for this demo, we're going to leave things at the default settings because there's a little extra setup you'd have to do for that that's outside the scope of this video. So I'm just going to leave this set to server-side encryption on the default option here. And we're also going to leave bucket key set to enable, just going with all the defaults. So I'll click on Create Bucket. And this should get us ready to go. So here's our bucket. We have this in place, and this should be ready for us to tie into our SFTP server. The other thing we have to do, though, before we do the full tie-in to everything, is create some IAM roles. I'm going to do that by switching over to the AWS IAM console, and we're already in the roles section here. I'm going to create a new role. You need to choose the service that's allowed to use this role. So since we're dealing with AWS Transfer Service, if I search for transfer, this is what it is. So it's called transfer here, but it's the transfer family, which includes AWS SFTP. So without any other options here, let's click Next to proceed. And this will take us to the permission screen. Normally, you'd have an IAM policy in place that you could attach to this role. But for simplicity's sake for this demo, we're going to do it a little differently. So for right now, I'm going to skip any permissions, and we'll deal with that in just a bit. So for now, I'm just going to click Next. We're going to give it a role name. We'll call this SFTP role. I'm going to leave the default description. You probably want to add a couple of more things perhaps. But then right below that, so the trust policy, by us having picked transfer from that dropdown earlier, this is setting up the trust policy so that the transfer service is allowed to assume this role and do any of the S3 actions that SFTP is going to require to our bucket. So if I scroll down a bit, we can see we skipped the permissions. We'll come back to this later. And as always, for good practice, we're going to tag our resource as we're creating it. And typically, we'd add more, but this is good for this demo. So I'm going to click Create Role. After clicking Create Role, we can see it here in our list of roles. Let's crack it open so we can edit the permissions that we skipped over earlier. So with this open, we can see there's no permissions in here. So what I'm going to do, just for simplicity again, I'm going to create an inline policy rather than a separate IAM policy that we would attach to it. So I'm going to click on Create Inline Policy. And this will get our permissions set up the way we need. So for service, we want to make sure this role has access and permissions to S3. And in here, there's a couple things that we need. We need, obviously, a get object, so we can download files from the S3 bucket. We want put object. This is going to allow us to upload things to our SFTP server. And we're also going to do, speaking of objects, we're going to do delete object. This might be questionable, and you may or may not want this depending on what you want your users to do. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we set the user up, at least in terms of how this might go a little crazy on you. But for now, it's just a demo. I'm going to add delete object to this. The last thing we need is to have list bucket in place so that users can do directory listings when they're using their SFTP client. This is going to allow them to just view the files, or list the files rather, that are in the S3 bucket. And speaking of bucket, we want to make sure we restrict this to the bucket we just created. We don't want it open to any and all buckets in the system. So I'm going to click the add ARN link that's here. And the bucket name that we created is sftp.sketchdev.io. That's our bucket name. And I'm going to copy this because I'll use that again on this next one as well. So it's setting up the ARN here for the permissions. And then for the object, we'll add it here as well. So the bucket is that. This one, though, we are going to say any object in here because we have no idea what the file names are in advance that people are going to be uploading to our bucket. So we need this wildcard in place. But additionally, this is where that delete object might be a little questionable, the delete object permission. Because we have the wildcard here, technically users have permission to delete anything and everything inside this bucket. And if you've got a number of users, multiple users using your SFTP server, that could be a bad thing, but I'll show you some little tips about what you can do with that later. So for now, let's click on Add ARN. So these are ready to go. Those are the only permissions I need, so I'm going to click Next. Give this policy a name. We'll call it SFTP S3 access. And we will click Create Policy. And with this policy in place, we can now see here's the permissions we gave it. Put object, get object, list object, delete object. I think it said list object, I meant list bucket. But these are the ARNs that are here, so it's only allowing permissions to that bucket we just created a little bit ago. That's pretty much all we need to do to get things moving forward with our SFTP server. So if we go back over to that console and take a look at our server, we do a refresh now. Our server is online, which is great. So all we have to do now is add some users to it. For the demo, we'll just be adding one. But let's get started on that. I'm going to click on the server link here to get inside the server to look at the details. We can look at a lot of things, a lot of different settings. When you first click on it, it does jump you down to monitoring, but since we have no users, nobody can use it, so there's no data here. So I'm going to scroll back up towards the top. You'll see a lot of this is the stuff that we set up earlier when we configured the server. Right below this section is our user management piece. So we can, from here, add a user, which is exactly what we're going to do. So click the Add User, and that'll get us going on that. Again, got to scroll up. Don't know why it was down a little bit, but so here we are. I'm going to, for this, we'll just go with RJ test. So that'll be me. This will be how I connect to the SFTP server. The role, this is what we created a little bit ago. So if I click this drop down, I should see our SFTP role, but if you don't, feel free to click the refresh button and try it again. So here we go, we've got our SFTP role. That's an option now. So if I click on this, this is telling the transfer family, our SFTP server, that whenever this user connects, it's going to have the permissions set up in there. I did mention earlier that you can specify things a little bit differently, that you could use session policies to apply to the user. And this can make things a little more restrictive. So that wildcard we were talking about earlier for the S3 permissions, especially that delete object option, I think you see it under here. Is this where it is? Yeah, this is part of it. Yeah, so if you click on info next to policy, it's got some really neat IAM tags you can use inside your permission definitions, and it can relate to things that are specific to the username, the home bucket, home directory, things of that nature. So you can read through this if you want to get a little more detail on that and more secure. I think also if you do this auto-generate policy and you click on view, it has that ready to go for you, and this is where it's going to restrict some of those things. Like list bucket is only going to allow you to get to your home bucket, and additionally that it's part of your home folder. I think there's some other things in here. Yeah, so the put object, get object, delete object, all those things, it ties you into that transfer home directory. So it doesn't matter necessarily which bucket. In our case, we're in essence hard coding the bucket we're going to connect to. So because we did our role the way we did, I'm going to leave this to none for policy, but please look into this some more so you can better secure your environment for your specific use case. It's just for the simplicity's sake of this demo. We're just keeping things a little more simple for the role, and we're going to set the policy to none. What I should see here, though, if I click on this drop-down, SFTP bucket should be in this list. So if I click on that, that's going to set up that being my home bucket for this RJ test user. Additionally, it pre-populates this subfolder with my username, so RJ test. Restricted to something else that would be worth looking into. I'm going to leave this off for now, and I'll show you what capabilities you get by leaving it off. But again, feel free to click the info button to read up what this is all about and why that would be more secure and beneficial in your case. Again, for best practices, I'm going to add some tags here, created by my name. And then the last thing that I skipped over is the SSH key. This is something that we need to do more specifically. This is something we need to have the end user do because this is going to create a private and public key, and we should never, ever, ever see that private key, nor should that ever be transferred. We don't want to create the key pair ourselves and then transfer the private key to that end user. That could potentially open up a huge security hole. We want the end users themselves to be the ones creating the key and sending us the public key. For the commands to do that, if you click this info link, it'll open up this pane over on the right-hand side with a link that'll tell you how you can generate the SSH key pair for the user. Again, this isn't something that we should do for our user. This is probably a link we should send our user for them to do themselves. That way they can send us the public key and not open any potential security holes. So for now, let's click on this link and look at the documentation. There's a couple of links. The most important one is probably the one for generating SSH keys. So you click on that, and it has instructions for how to do it in different operating systems. These are probably the links you ought to send the end user so they can generate the key and send you the public key. In my case, since I'm acting both as the server admin but also the end user, I do need to create my own key. So I'm going to follow the instructions for the Mac OS, Linux, or Unix. So I click on that, and if I scroll down a bit, this gives me instructions for how to do it depending on the key type I want to create. In my case, based on the SFTP client that I'm going to use, I don't think the version I have supports I don't think my version supports the ECDSA nor the ED25519. I'm just going to stick with RSA for the purposes of this demo, just because of what I believe my client supports. So for that, I'm going to use this command here, which I can do just by clicking copy. And then I'm going to go to my terminal window to get this set up. In my terminal window, if I run that command that I just copied, I want to make sure I change the key name. We'll call this RJSFTP. Tell it to go. It's going to generate the key pair, and it'll ask me if I want a passphrase. You can set this or not. It's probably more secure to have it, but I'm going to leave it blank in this case, so I'm just going to press enter again, and it's generated my key pair. If I take a look at that, there's two items in this directory now. I've got the public key. This is what your end users can send to you very safely and securely. It's not a concern. The private key, this is what you do not want to transfer between systems. This private key should only ever live on your end user's system. So in this case, because I'm both, I have both, but what we need to continue setting up the user in the transfer family on our SFTP server, I need this public key. So I'm going to do cat rjsftp pub, and I need this whole mess of stuff right up to those equals. You don't need this last bit, which is kind of like an email address or identifier. I don't know if Transfer Family will support you pasting that or not. I'm just going to grab this is the main key part that I have highlighted here. So I'll copy that. And if I go back to the Transfer Family setup, This is where I need to paste that public key. Once that's pasted, everything else here is all set and ready to go. I'll click Add. As you can see, it bounces me back down to monitoring for some reason. I'm going to scroll back up. So we're back on the server details, but if we scroll down just a smidge, here's that user's pane within the SFTP details, and we can see the user I just created. Everything should be ready to go at this point, so now it's time to give it a shot in our SFTP client. So now I'm going to open up my SFTP client, which in my case is FileZilla. Your client may look entirely different than this, but the general process for getting the SFTP connection set up is roughly the same. In my case, I need to go to Site Manager. This is where I can add different servers and connections for things I'm trying to connect to. And I'm going to click on New Site, and we'll just give it a name. Call it Demo SFTP. And over on the configuration side of things, there's different protocols that I can choose from. Obviously, we just set up an SFTP server, so that's what I need to choose here. Host is going to be sftp.letsplay.sketchdev.io, and then it's on port 22. Login type, we just generated those keys, so we're going to be using a key rather than a password. The user is rjtest, and the key file, I need to browse to right here, and again, we're not using the public key. That's what we uploaded to the server. We need to use the private key in this case. So keep in mind, this isn't something you would do. This is what your end user is doing. So they have the private key on their system, and as such, they're pointing their SFTP client to the private key. So with that, I'm going to choose Open. And there's really nothing else we need to do here, at least in FileZilla. Everything else with default settings are fine. So when I click on Connect, it should prompt me with this. It's a normal informational alert, just making sure that I'm connected to a trusted server. Ideally, this is probably something you should be giving your end users as well, so they know that they can trust the server based on the fingerprint. So if you look at this, it's asking, hey, I'm connected to this server, here's its fingerprint, is this a trusted server, is this who I should really be connecting to? So if you look at this, it starts with x1fp and ends with sudo. So going back to the SFTP console, if we scroll down a little bit more, we'll see there's a section for server host keys. Most importantly in here is the fingerprint column. So for our server, we've got this x1fp ending with sudo. Ideally, you're probably checking the whole thing, but since it's just a demo, I'm looking at start and end. There's a great chance this is right. Knowing that this is the right server, if I go back to FileZilla, I know this is the right server. It's got my host name. This is what we set up. This is the custom domain that I told the server to be on. So I can say, yes, always trust this host and add it to the cache. I can then click OK, at which point, if things went well with all the rest of our setup, I should be connected. And as we can see, directory listing is successful. So maybe we're good, maybe not, who knows? If there's no files here, how can we check? Well, let's just start uploading some stuff. So if I just randomly pick this file here, double click it, it's going to transfer it over. Again, if things go well. So now I see this over here on the server side. I see that file I just tried to upload. What's going to be even cooler to validate this worked, if I go back to my AWS console and go to my bucket here that we created earlier, let's drill in here. We can see under objects, there's a folder here that was automatically created for my user. If I click on that, there's the file I just uploaded. To validate this even further though, if I go, actually let's start here. So let's do an upload. And let's grab some other file here. Let's put this logo sketch.bitmap. Let's throw this in here. Let's say upload. Okay, that's done. Let's also go up a directory. So in the root, let's upload another file here. If I do an upload, let's pick a different file. Let's grab a sketchbug full color PNG. Upload that. Files uploaded. Great. So with those files uploaded in S3, if I come into here and I'm back in my SFTP client, if I do a refresh, look at that. The other file's in here now. So this is in my home directory here in RJ test. But if I go up a directory, let's double click that. Here I can see potentially the other users' subdirectories in here. We'll talk about that in just a second. So there's the file here that I uploaded in the root of everything, sketchbug full color. Something to keep in mind, if we go back to the SFTP server details and look at this user, actually let's click on the user. If I edit these settings, the one thing that we overlooked just a smidge maybe was the restricted aspect of things. Again, you can read all the details over here in this documentation page and understand what chroot is, but having this restricted would prevent me from being able to go up a directory and see all the other users. Maybe you want that, maybe you don't. Maybe some users are supposed to be admin users that can manage sub-users, directories, and files. So just keep that in mind when you are playing around with this restricted flag, but also how that relates to the fact that I was able to browse up a directory and see other files in here at the root level. But with that, I think our server is good to go and fully functional. One thing I will point out is this is not cheap. I mentioned that in the intro. I think if you look over on About Servers, you'll build for each hour at in US East 1, or here it is. So it tells you 30 cents per hour. So this can really rack up some charges, and it's worth making sure you clean all this up after you're done with the demo. Make sure that you truly want an SFTP server running in your environment and run those cost numbers before you do this yourself. Since this is just a demo though, I'm going to make sure this is all cleaned up, and I'll stop being charged the moment it's deleted for sure. I'm not 100% sure if it will stop charging you when it's in stop mode. I think the charges stop when you're stopped, but I don't know that for sure. Again, it's a demo. I don't need it anymore, so I'm just going to be 100% sure that I'm not being charged for it. So I'm going to delete the server, and this is a pretty fast action, a lot faster than booting up. So right then and there, it's not charging me anymore. So I'm in the clear. There are some other costs maybe with those files that I put in S3. Those are super minimal because they were small files, but just make sure you clean up things yourself before you forget about them and wait till your next bill shows up and you're surprised by it that way. And there you have it. With just a couple of clicks, you got yourself a full-fledged, highly resilient SFTP server. Thanks for watching this video. We hope you enjoyed it and found it very educational. For more how-to videos, please check out our channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again.